Chapter 3, 2016. By the spring of 2016, I'd been making steady progress at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, dealing with the worst floods since the 1950s, and trying to tame the environmental lobby. I was getting my feet under the table in cabinet, but the calm was superficial. In short succession, we had the Brexit referendum campaign with a shock result, a brutal Conservative Party leadership election, and a seismic US election result. Whatever the powers that might be have felt people wanted to change. My Brexit referendum campaign started with a hurried and unplanned departure from Europe. It was February of 2016, and we were on a half-term family holiday in Paris. The tiny Airbnb I'd found on the top floor at the apartment block near the Arc de Triomphe looked much more attractive in the photos than it turned out to be in real life. We had only been there a few days when the call came from London. Prime Minister David Cameron had completed negotiations on his new deal with the European Union. He was convening an urgent cabinet meeting the following day to showcase it and fire the starting gun on the promised referendum on the UK's continued membership of the EU. Not for the first time, a family holiday was kiboshed by political events outside my control. Remaining in Europe was not an option for me, so Hugh, Francis, and Liberty would have to tour the catacombs of Paris in my absence. The sudden recall was an unwelcome disruption, as I organised my hasty retreat back to London. I had a call with the Chancellor George Osborne, who would go on to be a key cheerleader for the Remain campaign, while he read out numbers from a PowerPoint presentation over the phone. I paced the top floor of that tiny apartment, and my heart sank. On the specific question of the EU membership, I had been on the fence for some time, and would rather have put the whole thing to the difficult pile. I was no fan of the EU, and had strongly opposed the UK's ever joining the Euro, the European single currency. In fact, it was my fundamental opposition to adopting the Euro that had finally prompted me to leave the blindly Europhile Liberal Democrats in the mid-1990s. Joining the Euro would have tied our hands and accelerated political union. Because if monetary policy were controlled at an EU level, it would have been hard to retain our control over matters of taxing and spending. That was a thick red line for me. But while I believed a deeper split would eventually come, I hadn't yet made the journey to backing a complete departure from the EU. Firstly, I was loyal to Cameron and Osborne. They had put me where I was. They'd supported me through various trials and tribulations. I was also just not bold enough at this point. I still believed in the system and working my way up through it. Despite my skirmishes in education, I did not yet realise how broken the system was. When I got back to London, there was a palpable tense atmosphere at the special cabinet meeting that Saturday afternoon. Clearly, the deal Cameron had negotiated with the EU was lame, and I could tell from the speeches around the table that this was going to turn into a massive psychodrama. For my part, while I said I thought the UK's long-term future did not lie within the EU, I questioned whether this was the right time for our departure. Having unexpectedly secured a Conservative government with a parliamentary majority at the 2015 general election, I felt these were our golden years to sort out Britain. I feared that extricating ourselves from the EU would require 10 years of government time and bandwidth that could otherwise be devoted to domestic reform. My personal political obsessions were addressing Britain's lack of competitiveness, high taxes, and bloated and lethargic public sector. We had yet to make any serious effort to begin taking apart Blair and Brown's legacy of red tape, legal constraints, and redistributionism. I was completely blindsided by the growing extent of the Brexit movement, both among Conservative MPs and in the country. By 2010, Euroscepticism was very much the mainstream attitude in the party, and I shared that outlook. But wanting to leave the EU entirely was then considered quite a far-out fringe position. Had I spent more time thinking about it during those years, I might have come to share that view. But I had been busy as a minister, knee-deep in floods and other distractions, with not much time for more existential thinking. Frankly, I also wasn't convinced the Leave campaign would win. In referenda, people tend to vote for the status quo. I failed to sense the public appetite for a big change. After all, they had just re-elected the Conservatives at the 2015 election. Clearly, the EU was distant and undemocratic. I had seen and felt that for myself at the regular gatherings of EU agriculture ministers in airless Brussels meeting rooms. Every major decision was stitched up in advance by the French and the Germans. The bureaucracy was an end in itself. The air of smugness and complacency was difficult to take. But I also thought the same about the civil service back home and many of the unaccountable quangos that operate in Britain. Footnote: Quangos is short for quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisations. These are public bodies that operate at arm's length from ministers, but are still funded by taxpayers' money and wield significant power. End of footnote. It would certainly have been in character for me to throw my weight behind the Leave campaign. I am someone who instinctively wants to shake things up, and part of me would have relished joining the side of the disruptors. Some of my colleagues put pressure on me to do so, pointing out that most of my friends and natural allies on the right of the party would be backing Brexit, and that gave me pause for thought. But while it was true that many people I liked and admired were fervent Brexiteers, there were also a number of people in that camp whose views troubled me. I was not seeing a clear, free market vision from those Brexiteers to use the opportunity of Brexit to ease regulation and increase global trade. Some of my friends, who were leading lights in the Vote Leave campaign, notably Matthew Elliott and Dan Hannan, certainly were making that case. But others seem to consider Brexit a charter for protectionism and anti-growth policies. That contradiction was never quite resolved during the campaign, and attention focused on rows about NHS funding, immigration, and short-term economic effects. I therefore decided, reluctantly, to back the Prime Minister and join the Remain campaign. Once I had taken that decision, my instincts as a campaigner kicked in and I got on with it. But I soon discovered that all was not well inside the Remain campaign. Branded as it was under the banner Britain Stronger in Europe, it seemed badly organised. And it was quite clear that despite officially backing the campaign, the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership didn't have their heart in the fight. It's fair to say the campaign was a mess. And while I was happy making arguments about free trade, I hated the uncritical celebration of the EU from some of the devout Europhiles on the campaign. I also didn't like their negativity about Britain, their sense that there was something vulgar about the idea of Brexit. So I found myself caught in the middle, approving of neither side's arguments. I did not believe the UK was doomed outside the EU, as the Remain campaign tried to suggest, but Vote Leave's main campaign message, infamously painted on the side of a bus, was simply a pledge to increase public spending on the NHS. This seemed an odd rallying cry for free market conservatives. There were good arguments for Brexit, but that wasn't one I found particularly convincing. The anti-growth and protectionist rhetoric emanating from elements of the Leave coalition didn't help either. That colleagues were fighting each other so brutally also poisoned the well inside the Conservative Party. I hated that people, friends, with whom I worked so closely, including most of my fellow authors of Britannia Unchained, a book I co-wrote with other Conservative MPs, were on the other side. One of the legacies of the referendum campaign was the protracted blue-on-blue fighting between fellow Conservatives. Once such discord has entered the bloodstream of a party, it is almost impossible to get rid of it, as we were to discover painfully over the ensuing years. The result, when it came, was a political earthquake. That dull June night, I was in the Blue Boar pub in Westminster, with some of the Remain campaign team having done a few interviews for the world's media on London's South Bank. Somebody was there with a spreadsheet plugging in the results as they came. Sunderland, the city known among other things for the speed at which they count ballot papers, had plumped for Leave in far greater numbers than we had expected. I could see the faces around me getting more and more anxious. I decided to leave the event and ended up wandering around central London in the middle of the night. As the results continued coming through and it became clear Leave had won, I felt a sense of disorientation. British politics had been changed forever. Not only had Cameron been crushed by his electoral coalition, had been dissolved, a coalition that had combined the affluent middle classes in the suburbs with more traditional rural voters, there was now a whole new swath of people to play. Working class voters from former mining areas in the North and Midlands, many of whom had never voted before, and among those who had voted, it certainly had never been for a Conservative. At the same time, much of the self-assured South found themselves out of kilter with the national decision. The next morning, just after 8 a.m, I tweeted my reaction. The British people have spoken. We must now put our shoulder to the wheel and ensure we leave the EU in the best way for Britain. A few minutes later, Cameron emerged to announce his resignation as Prime Minister, kicking off a leadership election in the Conservative Party. Some said he shouldn't have quit, but I don't think he had a choice. His point of view had been roundly rejected and on a voter turnout that was far higher than in any normal election campaign. I feel personal affection for Cameron, who gave me my first opportunities on the national political stage. He was a very plausible Prime Minister, intelligent, sharp-witted, and good at handling the media. Yet I never really sensed a drive to transform the country for him. And the bottom line is he was not prepared to do the bold things that Britain needed, and indeed demanded. After the financial crash, whether it was leaving the EU or much of anything else, there was a lack of clarity about what he wanted to achieve. There was too much wishy-washy flannel about the big society and general well-being. I don't believe he truly understood the scale of change required. With a bolder prospectus, I believe we could have won an overall majority in 2010, negating the need for a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. We could have done much more, and earlier, to reverse the energy-snapping legacy of Blair and Brown. Cameron and Osborne were good tacticians, but you can't have long-term leadership without a central vision. The tactical dice were rolled once too often. Having said that, and having in time made my own mistakes in the role, I do appreciate how hard it is to fulfill the office of Prime Minister. You are expected to be a front man or woman and a visionary, as well as an adept manager and implementer. Thatcher managed this by working night and day, but that was in an era where far fewer media demands and with the public general expecting less of the government. We are saddled with a 24-hour news cycle and perils of social media, and as a result, the challenges these days are immense. In any event, it was clear that Cameron's time was over. The country had voted for a big change, and we needed a leader, a team, and a plan to deliver it. Here was a new opportunity to move forward with a clear agenda. The obvious logic was that the party and country should be run by someone who had played a leading role in the Brexit campaign. Michael Gove and Boris Johnson stood out above all others, yet they themselves didn't seem to have planned for this eventuality. I had worked with Gove in the Department for Education. We had many rows, most of which he ended by reminding me that he was the boss, but we agreed on the fundamentals of the education policy. I did not know Boris as well, so my first call that weekend was to Gove, telling him I thought he should run. He immediately declined, saying he was backing Boris and that I should join his campaign. After a friendly meeting with Boris, I did so and decided to announce my support in an article in the Daily Telegraph. That article duly appeared the following Thursday, The same morning Boris was due to formally launch his campaign. Early that morning, however, I received a phone call from Gove. "Liz, you need to sit down for what I'm about to say. I've decided to run." My initial reaction was incredulity. I asked him what on earth he was talking about. Having declined to run when I suggested it over the weekend, he had spent virtually every waking hour since getting others to back Boris. Now, on the very morning of the campaign launch, he was asking, "Will you back me?" It was extraordinary. I muttered something about needing to think about it and hung up. It was a shocking development, and I was honestly devastated by it. Having initially favoured Gove, I had been entirely persuaded that Boris and he would make a winning combination, the showman and the fixer. There was also a strong democratic argument for it. The de facto leaders of the Leave campaign working together to deliver their mandate for Brexit. I had bought into the whole concept, and now he was telling me the partnership was off. I was due to be at Boris's launch event in several hours, and I had no idea what to do. As the news spread and chaos descended on Westminster, I decided I had to get out of the madhouse. That morning, my then 7-year-old daughter Liberty was performing in Mr. Sandman, a school play that I had been due to miss, so I went along to that instead and enjoyed the temporary distraction of normal life. Meanwhile, at his planned launch event, Boris made a shock statement withdrawing from the contest. Around lunchtime, I headed into my office at the Department of Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs to try to make sense of what had happened. My special advisor says he had never seen me so depressed. I just looked at him and said, "What were we both thinking? What the actual fuck?" That afternoon, Gove called me again, still seeking my support. By this time, my shock had given way to anger. I told him bluntly I could not back him. Whatever regard I previously had for him, his actions in stabbing Boris in the back were unforgivable. I simply did not understand how someone could do that. Gove had been in charge of whipping other Conservatives to support Boris until that very morning. I then received a call from Home Secretary Theresa May, who was keen to sign me up to her campaign. I had found her difficult to deal with in the past, but I was prepared to give her the benefit of the doubt. Given the situation in which the party now found itself, had Boris stayed in the race, I would have continued to honour my support for him, but after he dropped out, Theresa seemed to be the only viable candidate left. Funnily enough, this all brought back memories of a lunch I'd had with Boris in 2014, when I was an education minister, and he was Mayor of London. Always on the make, he tried tapping me up as to whether I would back him to be leader in the future. I said I couldn't guarantee it, but I would back him if he were up against Theresa May. There was yet more drama to come. Exhaustive ballots finally narrowed the contest down to 2 candidates to be put to party members across the country. Theresa was set to be on the ballot paper alongside Energy Minister Andrea Leadsom. But within days, Andrea pulled out after a media storm over an interview she'd given in which she had been a mother had granted her a large stake in the future than Theresa. From the reaction of my party members in Norfolk, I believed Andrea actually would have won if she had stayed in the race. But as it was, Theresa was declared the winner, unopposed, and became Prime Minister within days. Under Cameron, no planning had been done for the eventuality of a Leave vote. He and Osborne had, somewhat recklessly, you might argue in retrospect, banned civil servants from undertaking any such work. So the plan for Brexit right now amounted to nothing more than a blank sheet of paper. Theresa, to her credit, had been an effective Home Secretary, but she was not someone who obviously had a great vision for the future of the country. As far as a Brexit was concerned, this left lots of room for internecine warfare about what should actually happen, including the prospect of revealing the result as some of my democracy-denying erstwhile colleagues from the Remain campaign would try and have it. It also surprised me that some of the pro-Brexit side seemed to want to pursue a so-called Norway-style solution. This would have entailed remaining in the single market, but having to make contributions to the EU budget and being subject to laws and regulations from Brussels over which we had no say. Having crossed the Rubicon after accepting the democratic decision of the people, I was very much in the camp of doing Brexit properly. The EU wasn't going to play nice, and the worst thing Britain could have done would have been to end up as a supplicant of the EU. I believed we had to get on with the legal divorce and start urgently looking for new partners, like the US, with which to do trade deals. It was also imperative that we take back control of our borders. We could have not have half in and half out. Had Boris, with or without Gove, been a candidate in the leadership election, he would have been tested on this point. And the contest would have provided an opportunity for him to lay out a post-Brexit vision. Having been the face of the vote leave, he would have been then had the authority to strike a deal to leave on the terms he set. As it was, we were left with Theresa, whose views on the matters were largely unknown and whose principal proclamation on the subject was the rather meaningless slogan, "Brexit means Brexit." With Andrea, having quit the race, we were denied a leadership contest in which Theresa's views could be tested over several months. She thus became leader without a mandate from either the Conservative Party membership or the referendum. Combined with a narrow parliamentary majority, this puts her in a weakened position from the start. It was in this context that the next 3.5 tortuous years of Brexit negotiations began. Initially, Theresa benefited from the post-referendum civil war inside the Labour Party, which arose mainly because the party's enthusiastic Remainers blamed left-wing leader Corbyn's reluctance to embrace the pro-EU cause for the referendum result. While Corbyn eventually won the support of his party members in the country, if not his MPs, the turmoil helped propel the Conservative Party to large opinion poll leads of up to 20 points, and it seemed Theresa was well placed to deliver the change the British people had demanded. I remained hopeful that we would be able to seize that opportunity to make some fundamental changes at home too. But before long, my optimism was to be sorely tested. By the summer of 2016, a buzz was developing around the upcoming American presidential election. As an early fan of the TV show The Apprentice, I enjoyed the Donald's catchphrases and sassy business advice. In the smoking room in Parliament, various colleagues had revealed in doing competing Trump imitations. We were going to win so much, we were going to get tired of winning. Wandering through Swaffham, one of the market towns in my constituency, I was struck by the number of elderly ladies who were Trump fans, traditional Norfolk Conservative voters who probably also voted for Brexit. They seemed genuinely animated by the disruptive Republican candidate. It gave me pause for thought, as I realised that if he could have that sort of effect on traditional-minded middle-class conservatives on this side of the Atlantic, he perhaps had more of a chance in the US than was being predicted. Yet I was taken in by the establishment hype that Hillary Clinton would win. In the event, it was a case of déjà vu at the party held in the US Embassy on election night. Although this time I had absolutely no skin in the game, the embassy still then housed a rather utilitarian building in London's Grosvenor Square, compared to the expansive Winfield House, the official residence of the ambassador, was full of complacent Clinton supporters. As the night wore on and the early results came in, it seemed the American establishment was prevailing. Exhausted by the ongoing demands of my role as Justice Secretary and bored with the party, Hugh and I decided to head home. The following morning, I awoke to the radio with the news that Trump had won. Wow. What really struck me was that he had won the same types of areas in the US that had voted for Brexit in the UK, working-class strongholds like Ohio and Wisconsin. We were seeking a shake-up of American politics. with cities and suburbs being dominated by Democrats, while rural areas and small towns were taken up by the Republicans. Working class people were no longer automatically attached to the left. Your vote reflected the kind of country you wanted to live in. Those who had supported Trump or Brexit were not happy with the political menu that they had been served. Living standards were not increasing, with blue-collar areas in particular feeling that they had been left behind. All the while, they were being subjected to increasing pious lectures on green issues and served up a feast of political correctness, regardless of which party was in power. Although we had a Conservative government in Britain, the Blair legacy was very much remained in place. And in the US, Obama had shifted the policy dial to the left. Trump's rallying cry to "Make America Great Again" resonated with voters who agreed that America was not as great as it had been. The driving force behind Brexit had arguably been about making Britain great again. Of course, all this was hated by the establishment in Britain, and you almost have to feel sorry for the poor Foreign Office. They were only just beginning to compute that they would have to get on with delivering Brexit when it emerged that they would have to deal with an unreconstructed right-wing tycoon in the White House. This was a man who had very much made his reputation as a businessman. I was glad to see the back of an anti-British condescending Obama whose failures in Syria and on Russia would come back to haunt us. He had also presided over the slowest economic recovery since the Great Depression. Trump's election had, of course, upset all the usual suspects on the British liberal left. I generally thought his election would be good for the country and might even give the Conservative Party a much-needed kick up the backside to become more conservative. Trump was instinctively low-tax and derogatory. He was also, at heart, a deal-maker. And we were now in a situation post-Brexit where we had the opportunity to strike new trade deals. I concluded that voters on both sides of the Atlantic had seen things that I had missed about the way our respective countries were run. The vested interests that had held us back, along with the groupthink and caution that had led to our declining economic positions. I knew what the problems were already. After all, I'd co-written 2 books about them, set up the Free Enterprise Group, and already had a series of battles with the Blob. What 2016 showed me was how big this was, both the scale of change that was needed and the level of resistance that would be encountered. I believe voters have an instinct about things that often surpass those of us involved in politics. We struggle to see the wood for the trees. The way I got bogged down in DEFRA was a case in point. The Brexit referendum and Trump's election saw many people participate in the electoral process who had previously felt marginalised and unrepresented. Brexit and Trump caught their imaginations. That should not be ignored. This was all brought home to me when I heard a constituent of mine in Norfolk, after the referendum, proudly proclaimed, "We stuck 2 fingers up at London." It was a very revealing comment that hadn't struck 2 fingers up to Brussels, but London. This attitude, which I found to be a widely shared, showed the real disconnect between what the British governing class were up to and what people actually wanted. The referendum result had been a protest vote against the status quo and the establishment in Westminster and Whitehall, just as much as it was against the unelected bureaucrats in Brussels. They were registering a protest against decline in their communities, a result of decades of poor economic policy. But they were also taking a stand against what they saw as people talking Britain down. I had some prior experience with this attitude some years earlier, in 2001, when I was standing as a parliamentary candidate in Hemsworth, West Yorkshire. It was a solitary Labour seat in a mining community, and I was destined to lose, so I got little to no support from Tory HQ. But the one thing that really motivated people was my Keep the Pound stand, which we were set up in various locations to advertise the Conservative Party's campaign against UK entry into the European single market. As we campaigned in the streets and markets of Hemsworth and Featherstone, we found this message had a real resonance. Lifelong Labour voters came up to us to talk to us and said that they would never vote Conservative but were attracted to our patriotic appeal. It was more of a cultural statement than a political one, and I found that very interesting. That was what I thought of again as we saw the appeal of Brexit to many of the same people a decade and a half later. There would be much talk during the UK's 2019 general election about the voting habits of those in the so-called Red Wall, former Labour working class strongholds in the Midlands and north of England that cast aside their traditional allegiances to vote for Boris Johnson's Conservatives. But this has been a more long-term trend, with Conservatives starting to do progressively better in traditional Labour areas over several decades. The same story can be seen in the Rust Belt of the US, with similarly disruptive political consequences. The disdain for Brexit and Trump was universal among the British intellectual commensurate and left-leaning elites, who could neither understand nor accept what had happened. I hate that attitude. Sneering at people for voting for change and dismissing it as populism is not only disrespectful, but self-defecating. The truth is that political parties do need to be popular. If we cannot present our policies and ideas in a way that attracts more or less electoral support, we will never prevail. When people feel alienated from politics, it is our job to reconnect and win their trust. That doesn't mean offering them instant gratification or jumping on every passing trend. It means having a clear view of what people actually want, and showing how our policies will help them obtain it. Too many politicians think that they know best to spend their time trying to curtail people's ability to choose for themselves. I fundamentally object to that arrogant patriotism and challenging it as the heart of what I believe. As we saw in 2016, the instinct to rebel against an out-of-touch political establishment in a potent electoral force, a clear message was to be delivered in the US and the UK. I fear that 8 years on, the changes our countries wanted and needed have still not happened. Ultimately, an even bigger earthquake may have yet come before the message hits home.